Thank you, Kate. I appreciate that. Nothing like good weather in Montana and a topic surrounding revitalization to bring out the standing room only crowds. Thank you for being here. Again, my name is Tosh Weismiller. I'm the program coordinator with the Montana Main Street program. We're housed in the Department of Commerce in the Community Development Division and the Office of Tourism. And the Montana Main Street program focuses on downtowns across Montana and the revitalization of those downtowns through economic development, community development, tourism development, and historic preservation. So today, because they've given me so generously an hour, I'm going to talk about the program, our philosophy, what we're doing across the state, and provide some community examples. But I'm also going to interlace in that some heritage tourism and some historical context of tourism throughout Montana. So we'll be going back in time, back and forth, but I will guide you through so not to lose track. In the Montana Main Street program, like I said, we're housed in the Montana Department of Commerce, and it's a collaborative effort between Community Development Division and the Montana Office of Tourism. These are powerhouses of grants throughout the state focusing on bettering communities. And so being part of both has really worked to get the word out there about the Main Street program and our wider reach throughout the state. We're part of the National Main Street Center. Now that's a wider national movement of communities to restore their downtowns. And I'll show you a map in a minute, but there's thousands of communities that are working to restore downtown business and downtown cultural and historical assets in communities. In Montana, we have 21 member communities statewide, and we've been growing. There's been some significant interest in this program, which really underscores what's happening at the community level throughout Montana. So while we have 21 members, we have more than twice that many looking to join, forwarding ideas, and working with me on a regular basis to improve their downtowns. And then we focus on planning projects, emphasizing organization, promotion, design, and economic restructuring. Those are our 4 pillars, and I'll walk you through what those mean as we move through the presentation. So here's the map of Montana. You're all looking for your hometown. And we have 21 member communities. Now you see 2 stars. Those are designated communities. That means they've been established in the program for some time and have really demonstrated downtown revitalization and steps towards that. They would be Butte and Stevensville. But that's really not to overshadow what all of our other communities, all the dots you see, are affiliated communities, what they are doing, because there's great work, as you'll see, going on across the state. Now, the national program, again, they focus on those designated programs. So they see 2 triangles in Montana, not the 21, but they're recognizing the work done across the country. Now, my family's from Miles City, and 2 generations. And so I always like to show how big of a state Montana is by using this James Masterson illustration from the 1930s. And so he's showing here that, look at how many eastern states you would have to drive through, going the distance traveling west through Montana from the east before you even saw mountains. And they're really showing that driving through all those states, Montana is a huge state and one that has a lot of parts that don't have mountains. So just to illustrate how large Montana is, I took Montana and I threw it right into the Midwest to give you an idea of, again, how large of a state we're talking about here. So Havre suddenly becomes Chicago, et cetera. You get the idea, but there are a bunch of states within the Montana territory there. Look what happens when we put it into New England. I believe there's 11 states that Montana territory can touch if you were to position it in New England. And why not? Let's just throw it right into Europe, too, to give you an idea of what the state of Montana would look like if we put it right over the Benelux countries. There's 13 countries under Montana. Granted, they're small, but that's the point, that we have a huge state when we put it in the context of other things. And so to illustrate this once again, this really shows 2 things. One, that Europeans are very bad at geography. As you can tell, this was a scientific study done last year where they had random people from Europe fill in a map of the United States. And here we're Wyoming with a question mark, Montana, they switched that. Montana, also Montana, Wyoming, maybe, and then not Canada. So they're close there. But seriously, what it very much shows is how large of a state we live in. And I've made that point a few times already. But really, I drive all across this state, and we know, we all do, how big of a state this is. And so in a program like the Montana Main Street program, it becomes essential to really focus on that wider network of communities throughout the state, to share best practices, to make sure that Eastern Montana communities are communicating with Western Montana communities, and again, sharing best practices and learning from one another and working together in a wider region. And so with the Main Street program, we're focused on technical assistance and organizational assistance. So basically what that means is that I am a resource for Montana communities in the planning stages of projects, and I am a resource to help them follow those projects through. And so some communities will use me for the initial stages, but also that organizational assistance to come into the community to work with them as in their planning meetings or attending board of directors meetings to help them form committee structures to forward work in the community. We have an annual conference this year. It's September 24th through 26th. Right here in Helena, and I've got brochures over there. That's my plug. So we have a downtown conference. We have a resource library, that wider community network that I keep talking about, and a competitive grant fund that member communities use to realize the projects in their town. So you can see that they're using us for a technical resource, and then we provide the financial resources to carry out the projects. So again, our mission here is that we're dedicated to bettering the economic, historic, and cultural vitality of downtowns through, like I said, community development, revitalization, tourism, and historic preservation. And those four pillars, organization, really we're looking at making communities aware that they're much more effective when they're working together. If you have 5 different organizations in a downtown, all with great ideas, but maybe working in different directions, that's not as effective as it could be if they're all communicating and sitting at the same table. And so it really shows the importance of cooperation and coordination, but it's not that alone. You need to balance it between all 4 points. And that's the idea here, is it's a comprehensive approach to revitalizing downtowns. So promotion is creating that positive image and capitalizing on your community pride and doing the same with investors. Design means getting your Main Street into top physical shape. That means repairing storefronts and thinking about the historical architecture in your town and how to improve upon that. And then economic restructuring, looking at really diversifying your community economic assets, business development and recruitment, et cetera. And so another way to look at it is dividing it between heritage assets and human assets. So think about leveraging the built history in your community, leveraging that cultural history, the entrepreneurs, and your public. Or think of it as developing space, markets, businesses, and partners in your community, and balancing that approach. And in the program, what we're really looking at is to bring in a community, help them along the way, and get them to where they can advance in their progress and their planning so that they come in with ideas, we can find them funding, we can work with them to plan it in an organized approach that's most effective, and then to implement that. And so we're really looking for that long-term vision in your community. So maybe you'd look at the downtown and say, we want to bring in tourism, or we want to recruit businesses to the downtown that complement the ones that are already here. Or maybe there's buildings that are endangered that need historic preservation. That's another approach that we can take, and really it's looking at balancing all of those in a community. So, like I said, I'm from Montana. I've driven a lot of miles, but I'm from White Sulphur Springs. And White Sulphur Springs looks like this on a sunset. It's a beautiful place. And, so sometimes it can be, we'll fix that. There we go. That's a better picture of winter in White Sulphur Springs. I like that better. But I'm from White Sulphur, and I worked, my family are small business owners, and I worked there growing up, and worked hard there growing up. And I've driven all over this state, and really in this position. So in a year and a half, I've driven 15,000 miles, and so I'm not complaining. It's a wonderful job. You get to visit lots of communities, work with them, and so and 5 years ago, when I'd drive across the state and I'd visit somewhere, let's say Helena, for instance, being from White Sulphur Springs, people would say, oh, you're from White Sulphur. White Sulphur Springs, they would kind of laugh and say. And I had never heard that before. Living in White Sulphur, no one comes to town and says, oh, this is White Sulphur Springs. So I had never heard that. Being from a small business family, working hard, you know, it was kind of an insult, but I understood what they meant. But still, didn't like it. Well, now, in these 15,000 miles that I've driven, I hear something else. I don't hear White Sulphur Springs anymore. Now, I hear Red Ants Pants. Every single time. I could be in Glasgow, I could be in Miles City, up in Kalispell. People are talking about this. And so it's encouraging, and it's a wonderful opportunity for the town. An entrepreneur in Bozeman reads Ivan Doig, is inspired, and goes all the way to White Sulphur Springs to start a business, and then a foundation and a music festival, and does a great job at it too. And so she was inspired by place, a Montana place, a Montana rural place, and did all this in a community capitalizing off of its local assets and making them a strength rather than a perceived weakness. And so, you know, you start looking at your hometown in a different way. People say Red Ants Pants, and then immediately they say, you know, I'm going to go next year. And I didn't realize how beautiful it was. I'm going skiing, I'm going hunting, fishing, the Smith River, the museum, the hot springs, and they start talking about the community. And then they talk about where they're going to stay and where they're going to eat. And suddenly, it's a different frequency that's being sent out by the town. And so now the community is looking to leverage that. How can we connect this historic resource with its archives and carriage house to the downtown? How can we get people who visit that, that festival to visit the local museum? What can we do with this depot and these train cars that are actually, they've been there for a very long time. I was a kid climbing through these. In fact, there was one that's no longer there. They relocated it that had chandeliers and everything original in there, and it was unlocked. I just walked in as a kid, and you know, so it's a part of my childhood in a way, but also here it is in my profession, and it's an opportunity. And so they're looking at this as, this is on the way to the Smith River access point, the festival. Why can't we use this as well? Couldn't this depot be a gallery? Couldn't the train car be converted into some gallery of historic photos or what have you? There's a local guitar maker in White Sulphur Springs. Who knew? Why not put him in here during the festival so that someone can see a guitar being made, have music? This is actually, all this land is owned by the museum. This could be a cultural park. There could be a lot to be done with it, and talks are, how do we get it to where people could come in and have it be some sort of heritage site where, not a heritage site, but a cultural or heritage attraction where you come in and you could learn about John Ringling and the railroad in the valley and the history of it. And looking at buildings in the downtown, not as problems or eyesores or vacant locations, but potential. What would it take to get someone in there? In the last year, I've had 2 conversations with people completely unrelated to my job, just at my daughter's friend's birthday party. People come up and say, I want to open a gallery, I want to start a business, I'm coming back to Montana, and I want to move to White Sulphur Springs. We love it, we're going back. So there's pride in a place. And so in Montana, with the opportunity between Yellowstone and Glacier and tourism, we've seen a long history, a 100-year history of opportunity in the form of tourism. And you see it in the promotional images that come out of Montana and reports. Here's a report from the 50s talking about, you know, tourism business and get your share. You know, of course, you know, get your slice of the pie. It's not quite that simple, but look at here in the 50s, they're talking about combining agriculture and industry and tourism in a balanced approach towards community development and economic development. And it became a part of our culture. And in a lot of instances, in some instances, Main Street's moved inside. This is Old Town, Charles Bovey's Old Town in Great Falls. This is in the agricultural fair building, and it was there for about a decade as an attraction off a major tourism corridor. And really, it was the start of historic preservation efforts in Montana, in conjunction with some others, but it was a major one. And of course, those buildings became Nevada City. And so here, tourism and history connect very much in a community. And when we look at the reports and the studies coming out today out of the Institute of Tourism, Recreation, and Research in Missoula, we can see that still, I told myself I wouldn't use the laser pointer today, but I'm going to break that. But look at where visiting museums, 17% of people driving through Montana are visiting museums, but then 13% have an interest in Lewis and Clark sites, 30% recreational shopping. That probably means downtowns or privately owned businesses, not likely chain stores. They can see those anywhere, but they're in Montana and they want to stop at those places in a White Sulphur Springs, for instance. And people love scenic driving. 67% love that scenic driving. But what I like about it is 62% of people, according to this survey, were repeat visitors. That means that anyone with out-of-state license plate at rest stops throughout the state, they surveyed quite 11,000 plus people, all said we're repeat visitors, meaning they're returning, they're coming back. And I've talked to a lot of people in communities that are driving from Seattle to Minneapolis, and they always stop in Missoula, they stop in Miles City, they love the downtowns, they love the original architecture and the downtown businesses as well. So consider the context of this. So here we are, Montana and Wyoming. And Montana and Wyoming, we're going to ignore Idaho just for this presentation for the sake of simplicity. But Montana and Wyoming were the only two states that became states with a national park already in existence. So that's Yellowstone, of course. And then came along Glacier National Park in 1910. And so by the time Montana became a state, it had been, 21 years went by before it had two national parks. And so what I'm pointing out is it's a rarity that you have a state become a state after a national park. And it's also rare that you have two national parks so quickly and close to one another. Look at Wyoming as an example. Grand Teton didn't become a park until 1929, although land issues and other things in its current form, that didn't really take place until 1950. So whereas Montana only had 21 years as a state before it had two national parks, Wyoming had 60 years before it had two national parks. And look at where those are. They're up in the left corner of the square. And where are the population centers? Well, we'll talk about that. So look at the travel corridor here coming into Montana as automobile tourism takes off in the 20s and 30s. And so you see this influx from east and west, and that's not surprising. But once people get here, and this probably sounds familiar to these days, but look at this. The travel corridor starts to flow between parks. People come out to Glacier, and then they go down to Yellowstone, and then they head back. So they're kind of making a loop. Look at the population centers. Compared to Wyoming, you have Cheyenne and other communities completely separate from their national parks. In Montana, we had them early, and our population centers are right in that travel zone for those parks. So, and look at this map too. Look at how, some other states, like Wyoming, you've got the highways that go through and they kind of cut across the corner, or look at that big central location there in Idaho. In Montana, you have this crisscross of travel, going north, going south, Canadians coming down, people going east and west. But again, it really encompassed the communities, and of course there were all sorts of trail and highways going cross country at that time. And so one of my favorite examples would be the National Park-to-Park Highway. This started in 1920, and the idea, and this is a poor map, so I apologize, but if you can kind of see, the idea was to create a road that, a road by 1920 definition, and Model T travel. But consider the idea here was grand. We've created national parks, now let's create a road that connects them so that someone could come out to the west and travel all these. Now, when I look at that, that's a daunting trek. I haven't even been to all these national parks, and I've lived in a lot of these states. But look at what happens. You go from now Yellowstone to Glacier, and so now that travel makes sense. There's that connection. And so this is what that road looked like. The National Park-to-Park Highway wasn't paved right away. That sign says under construction. That remained under construction for quite some time. There's a picture of Kings Hill actually in the winter, and you can picture the ruts and the mud and the snow. And so the opening tour of the National Park-to-Park Highway in September of 1920 started in Denver, downtown Denver. And so you have this wonderful connection of urban and rural at the time. So you have these people in their mink coats and their heels and their hats get into their cars in Denver, and then end up in complete wilderness by their definition. In Model Ts with no air conditioning and dust, and you can picture it. But they did this tour, and they wanted to prove that the roads were good, so they went really fast. They started in Denver, they went up through Montana, they got to Seattle before all the cars broke down, someone got sick, probably dust, inhalation. But basically they made a lot of photo stops, and so they made the first stop in, in Montana, right at the gateway there, and then they pulled into White Sulphur Springs at the Sherman Hotel right downtown, which juts out into that main street because different business owners were competing with each other. That building no longer exists. They got there, and the president of the National Park Highway Association told the crowd, White Sulphur Springs, you're an old town which appeals to us as bringing back the days of the mining camps. You don't even realize what you have. The old relics will bring even people of Europe to see, even though they're bad at geography. But basically what he means there is that you have a cultural and historic nature that will attract people in this realm of national parks. But he was also kind of inferring your role and your kind of living history, but that's probably getting too involved. But really, he was pointing out the fact that there was potential in towns on this highway. And so look at the numbers. In 1920, 80,000 visitors to Yellowstone, and almost, it goes from 80,000 to 260 in 9 years. These numbers are growing huge. And so if you have, again, 1929, 260,000 people coming to the state, and at the same time, 74,000 in Glacier, better highways over time just meant more people, and you see that through the war years. Of course, more people on the roads meant kind of attractions like this, all Montana native animals. This actually, it's hard to see, it's pixelated, but that says "See 'em alive." There were animals there, and so tourists would stop. So, and so when an influx of people coming in, maybe the tourism isn't always authentic, and I guess that's the point I'm making. So there's these kind of humorous, you'll never be the same again, pick up a grizzly bear cub. But it was perpetuated by years of railroad promotion, which was a little over the top. And so that's kind of how the stage was set at first. But as more and more people came in, Montanans, you get this sense when you look at the promotions of people really getting an idea of ownership in a place and taking pride in their place. Not that they didn't before, but when you suddenly have those huge, the numbers of influx coming in, you really take a strong look at your community, think about beautifying it, improving it, protecting it. And so you see things like this, and we see this still today, but you see images where we're talking about protecting the environment, and let's not read into that, but it's just protecting our home and protecting our communities. And taking pride in place that you see in a lot of promotional images. Suddenly we realize, wow, we really are a great place, aren't we? And borrowing this from the Montana, the magazine of history, this was an article a few years ago, and it really shows how, it's called Montana's Failed National Parks, but when you look at it, these highways and getting people on the road it wasn't just non-residents, it was also residents. And so you see a huge influx of attempts to create national parks. That failed because it takes a lot to create a national park, but a lot of those failed national parks became state parks. And so you can really see that really, again, illustrates the value by people driving and seeing these locations. And again, history really becomes present in this effort. And so here's the National Park to Park Tour. This is Nyhart, a mining town, a successful mining town at the time. But it gives you an idea of the draw that this spectacle had when people came in. But it really was there was hope, there was promise, and it was illustrating an industry that had some potential that was maybe different than ones that came before it. Here's Browning. Here's Great Falls. This sign says the park-to-park highway is as important to Great Falls as a new railroad. So, highways, they were seen as potential, better trade, and better opportunity. And so communities really, here's Great Falls that suddenly, they're not, in the Golden Triangle or on the plains or, the falls. They're on the Pan-American Highway. It's this larger context that communities were recognizing themselves within. And at the same time, Great Falls looked at trying to capitalize it. So here's a car, a successful business owner in Great Falls put together this car with different advertising spots, and they drove out to Boston to highlight highlight Great Falls. And so what's interesting about it is when you take a closer look, this is humorous. You have Great Falls as the seat of Cascade County, 6 theaters, 6,000 automobiles, 5,000 homes, 100,000 trees. Lowest death rate, undertakers are starving here, but also the gateway to Glacier, there's springs, we have a lot of electricity. We're the best lighted cities in the world. The point here is that this was a modern community with modern opportunities within a scenic splendor of national parks. Again, the railroads were promoting wilderness. Here we're modern, but within that wilderness, and I'm using all these terms in quotes, by the way, but it showed the opportunity. And so you see a lot of communities really trying to capitalize on that. And so you see it in our promotional materials. This is an envelope that was sent out to a Minnesota family, and it was found in a desk years later, and just in the last 5 years, it's now in the archives here at the Historical Society. But it became, that vacation land feel became part of the identity, and so you see that in the state, but you also see history as part of that enter the fold, and the interpretation of our place. And that gets us to Charles Bovee in Old Town. Again, that historic preservation in a community right off of that National Park-to-Park highway. The park came through the highway came through in 1920. Within 10 years, there was an effort to collect on the part of Charles Bovee. Within 5 years after that, efforts were to create this and make it an attraction in the community, which of course it did. And there was living history there, and it became a local museum, and it really started the effort of how do we want people to see us? How do we want to be seen? How do we want to market ourselves? And so his effort really, and it started the Save Our Landmarks effort and others, and really rooted historic preservation in Montana. And so you see Great Falls putting itself as a major distribution city and a major urban center between the parks. And why not? Let's bring it up to speed today. So this is talking about historic preservation in Great Falls. The Main Street program, we remember, and that was my contacts for heritage tourism, so I'll reintroduce you to the Main Street program now. We focus on revitalizing the downtowns through grants, and so our contacts in Great Falls came in, and through a modest grant of $3,000, decided that they would do architectural renderings of this building. It's the Arvon block. If you're familiar with Great Falls, it's right down by the Civic Center. And
Father had a store in that building.
How about that? That's the first time that's happened in presentations. And so here it is, and for some time it sat vacant. And the conversation in the community, when it starts to look like this, historic preservationist Kate, there's a pigeon here, that's not a good sign. And so you have this building where the different parts of the community are saying, is there value in saving this structure? Should we knock it down? What should be done with it? Some people don't want to look at it because this is the reality. It's sat vacant. It's hard to really say, we should bring a business in there. So the group came in and through a modest grant through the Main Street program, did an architectural rendering and identified ways to improve the building and the potential, because sometimes when you're talking to investors and the city and others, it's a lot easier to sell the idea when it looks like that as compared to this. And so it was simple as a very modest grant, and then what Great Falls did was they took that and they put that into their master plan, made it city vision, worked coordinating with all different partners in the community to identify a business that could go in there, investors, et cetera. And today it looks like this. And so a complete transformation. There's the Celtic Cowboy Irish pub. There's a wine tasting room in the basement. Upstairs, there will be a boutique hotel coming in. That really tries to preserve some of the historical elements of the building. But this project created 50 jobs in a spot that had none before, and that adds to the tax base. And so that group, I'll back up just a bit, but this is what the building looked like at the time, and this is what it looked like now on that first floor. That's a little dark, but you get the idea. And they tied it into their local effort to bring people into the community, kind of had fun with it. but it got a lot of attention. And as part of that grant, we didn't just do a rendering on the one building. We also focused on the Rocky Mountain building, which suffered a fire and sat vacant for a long time in the downtown. But this is an important point because that same group that identified the Arvon block as a major project decided that this was a top priority for all groups: economic developers, historic preservationists, housing people, tourism, the city. They all came together and realized that they're trying to get to the same goal in different ways. Why convince someone that historic preservation is important as compared to economic development when you can unify around a single project and realize that they're both, that project encompasses those ideas and that they're both important. And so in the community here, they conducted this rendering of the Rocky Mountain building. Again, there's retail potential, housing, there's a historic theater in the building. There's some effort to try to restore that, but that's a major undertaking, not always possible. But it really shows you that a project can really get results, even with a small dollar amount invested, and they really got a lot of leverage out of that. And they recently came in for another grant to do 6 more renderings, hoping that in total, one day, they'll have 8 total projects like this in their community. And so really you can see how we helped them along the way for their great idea. They did their work locally to realize a wonderful result. And so looking at the context between parks here, communities, when you look at the maps, communities start to position themselves in the center of this opportunity. It's not anything unusual. We tend to do that. But you have, as people were driving into towns and communities in the tourism trade, you had communities producing maps that prominently displayed them as the center of this new tourism economy. So here you'll never guess where this map was produced. So Butte produced this map. They're the happy hunting ground. They're the center of Montana, or at least western Montana. And if you're crazy enough, now remember that National Park-to-Park Highway? This was about the same time. It went through Livingston and north. Great Falls is hidden behind here, so there's no National Park-to-Park Highway. And Butte redrew the map so that it's a treacherous route to Helena, and Helena is a very small town, so you probably don't want to go there. And besides, the highway goes this way, certainly not anywhere towards Glacier National Park. So Butte really centered itself in the middle here. Look at other maps. They left Helena off completely. There's no Helena. Why go to Helena? And if you look at the maps and you add up the mileage, there's also kind of the trick of, the Helena trick, which was, it's 375 miles from park to park. And this is the time where you couldn't cover that in a day. The cars took longer, so you needed somewhere to stay. You needed gas. Otherwise, you're from Boston, driving into the wilderness, so you need to be assured that your family is safe. And so the maps kind of alluded to the fact that it wasn't 375 miles, it was only 275. You could make the Helena route, but once you're on the Helena route, if you're adding up the mileage, of course, you can't really turn around. So, how to direct tourists. Bozeman, way ahead of its time, centered itself, all roads leading to Bozeman, so they didn't even need to really compete with the parks. All these other towns were just driving to Bozeman, clearly. Even Harlow got into it. This is a little bit later than the context I'm talking about, but they really capitalized on being the fastest route across the Treasure State as traffic came in and in. And of course, being in Harlow and in the Lewistown area and close to Malmstrom, they started to market themselves as in the heart of our national missile defense system. So every community finds an opportunity to center themselves. And so you have exciting vistas and friendly natives and down to earth. So, we all found our ways to do that. And it isn't unusual. Here's a map of New Zealand. They're down under, remember. So this is their view of the world, which makes complete sense if you lived in New Zealand. To folks like us, it doesn't make any sense. But again, it's not unusual. And communities like Butte, for instance, really started to take a new look at their position in this new economy. Now, there's a lot of things at play here, copper prices and others, but Butte in 1924, a successful year, was creating promotional materials that had murky copper-colored water reflecting smokestacks of progress. I hear this became the Berkeley Pit eventually. And then they started to look at themselves within 10 years in a different light. Here's Butte. Even today, I work with Butte people, and it's the Hill, and it's the Uptown, and there's a lot of great things going on there, and we'll talk about that. But one of them said to me, I just realized that if you turn around and you look away from the uptown, there's some great mountains over here. It's really beautiful in Butte. And so, they clearly understood that back in the day. And remember, this is the town that used copper letters to send out promotional letters saying how beautiful Butte was. This is back in the 30s, I believe, and they were sending these out saying you should invest here, there's a lot of prosperity, but there's also a beautiful locale. And so bringing Butte up to our time now, in the Main Street program, they've done great work. They have ghost signs all throughout their downtown. They came through the Main Street program to do a study of those ghost signs, and they're looking at the potential of restoring them or preserving them. There's a few camps at how to go about that. But the local group there is looking at bringing in grants to create artisan center and bring in cultural attractions, filling some of those buildings with a vibrant community of artisans and galleries. There's the folk festival that brings in a large amount of people every year. And there was this project, a wonderful tax credit project, and this brought in lofts in the community. So apartments, housing in the downtown, the Hennessy market, a nice urban market. Butte has created 144 housing units since 2006 at an investment value of $12 million. And so these things take time. Butte has a large hill to climb, no pun intended, but of its own making. But look at what else is happening. This was a vacant building 3 years ago, and then entrepreneurs came in. This is going to sound familiar to you. Entrepreneurs come in. They're inspired by the place, they love the history, they want to start a business. They start a distillery and call it Headframe Spirits. They win a great great award for creating a sign that recalls the head frames there. They use a local artisan. And they create a business that trades internationally and uses Montana products when they can, and they name all their stills after Butte mines. So there's that connection to history in a business. And it's quirky, they sign their own bottles. People love that sort of thing. And so in a community like this, looking at vacant buildings as potential opportunity and capitalizing off of what you have, is a different way to look at things than, oh, there's just empty buildings and what are we going to do? But again, there's a lot of work to be done. And the community is looking at ways that they can do historic preservation plans, look at the buildings, and proactively address which ones are most endangered and may fall down, and which ones they can try to salvage and do it in an organized fashion. So here's a tourism study that was done on Butte, and this is interesting because you get to see 250 results of what out-of-towners thought about Butte that were traveling through Butte, and so many of them said people and history. And so when you look at this, and you've got this uptown that has organic cafes and local business in it, 78 of 200 responses mentioned history, historic, old buildings, museums. Now, some people were like, I didn't like this restaurant, I didn't like Butte, but 78 were saying, I love the history here. I'm sorry, 40%, 78 of 200, loved the place for what it had and what it was and what it was becoming. I know people from Bozeman who go to Butte and say, Butte's, wow, it's really changed. You got to go there. I'm going back. And so, there's the folk festival and bringing people in. Here's a head frame, and it kind of, there's a lot of local pride, but in a way it was kind of haunting any sort of movement forward for Butte. Well, look, they turned it into a stage for their folk festival, which brings people downtown and really changes that frequency, similar to White Sulphur Springs, and changes it to one of opportunity. And they really focus on getting people in the downtown and shopping and recognizing a new Butte. And they capitalize history. And in Montana, you saw promotional images that continued to bring in historical images. And this is from 1929, but already we were talking about that Montana has a historic background. There's the tourism. There's not a monotonous mile in Montana. There was a lot to look at and a lot to experience. And other promotional materials, you saw that kind of Old West feel, and you saw it juxtaposed with modern Montana. Now, if you can see this, here's high-rises. That must be Billings, right? It's got to be Billings because there's high-rises. But look at, so there's this sense of the history of Montana with I interpret this to mean opportunity. Montana's growing. There's promise. There's potential. But there's history. So we're down to earth, but we have huge potential. And then you see it in some of these materials published by the Highway Department. This is from 1936. And this is another image of Montana history sitting and being amazed by a highway that can come in and cars that can just speed along. So progress, modernism. But the American Indian is signing wagon. And so everyone's just sitting in marvel of, the relics, if you will, to the progress. And so, again, it was based on hospitality, welcoming people into our state, but it was also an opportunity to market our history. And we did it way ahead of our time, the history through a windshield here, these highway markers. Virginia, the state of Virginia, was one of the first to implement theirs. Montana wasn't far behind. We were really ahead of the curve with creating these historical markers along highways, and it probably has to do with all those numbers coming in. It really forced the issue. And so what a wonderful opportunity to create this, but doing it in a way that was accessible, but also authentic. Because there'd be a lot of incentive to just kind of throw and package the material. Remember, this is approaching what people, the Disneyfication of history. Here we are doing it correctly. And so people would come out here and then they'd write to the Highway Department, do you have a book on this? I loved those. Those were great. I couldn't drive the whole state, so I'd like to know more. And Bernard DeVoto, a famous historian, actually wrote an article in Harper's Magazine applauding our efforts and, and said that while Montana isn't a rich state with a budget that can implement this easily, they create that dramatic effect, I guess. So the idea here was to give the historical tourist, and that's an interesting term too, because now we call those geo-travelers people who want to see authentic history and locations. But basically, it's well written, etc. But basically, it excludes the ancestor worship of the organized descendants of the pioneers. So it was authentic. And this was well ahead of its time before people started talking about things like that. But again, when you see the potential, we had a huge amount of people coming in at the time from states to the east and west, and so you can see how Alaska, there's a huge amount coming in Canada too. So you can see again that intersection of tourism corridors. You can see why we started to look at Old West and Montana, but also the progress. And so in a lot of the materials that were marketed, you have the scenery, you have the history, and you have pioneer relics and markers, which a lot of times are state parks, historical sites now. And so really capitalizing on that and doing it in a responsible way that doesn't just sell out to the tourism opportunity, but really forwards what you're proud of in your community. And so here we are in Terry, Montana, a town of about 700 people beyond Miles City. Terry, Montana came in and got a grant through the Main Street program to do numerous jobs. There was some coordination with the SHPO, and so they came in and they did a heritage tourism action plan. And Kate played a role in that too, so I applaud Kate's efforts in that. But we came in and we did a branding workshop. They saw that this was the home of Evelyn Cameron, and there wasn't any marketing of that. That wasn't getting out to the people who were visiting. And so they came in and did branding in their community. They had a wonderful trail system. They had historic hotels, the oldest operating hotel in the state. And so they created these materials by planning it, branding, and going about it in an organized fashion. They printed these materials so they could hand them out, all through the Main Street program. And then they created a growth policy, which is a document that really forwards the efforts of a community and economic development. But in that, again, partially funded by the Main Street program, but basically they wanted to maintain a sense of community, but also open up the opportunity for development in light of the Bakken opportunity. And so create a sense of Montana Place, maintain that downtown, and allow for growth, but responsibly so that we don't lose our identity by growing too fast. I went to graduate school in Arizona, and I lived in Chandler, Arizona, and the population now is 280,000, about Spokane-sized. In 1980, it was 20,000 people. Imagine if in that time, Helena grew in 30 years to sprawl from here to Three Forks in no time overnight. So that community is struggling with a lost sense of identity, and people who have moved in that don't even know what the history of the town is or don't support the museum. And so there are communities like this being proactive and coming together. Terry, Montana is a wonderful example of a dozen people that came together and over dinner at each other's houses on a rotating schedule changed the course of their community identity and the development of that community. So they looked at what they wanted to do. They identified structures, and so they have the Prairie County Museum. Adjacent to that was this building here, if you can see it. Just an empty building in the downtown. And they are currently working to renovate it into the Evelyn Cameron Heritage Center. On the other side of the museum, down the street here, there's the Evelyn Cameron Gallery, which has copies of historical resources. The originals are located in this building, but they have copies of the historical resources on Evelyn Cameron. They have photos of hers on display. So now, on a major tourism highway, corridor through Terry, you can exit and come and see a heritage center and a gallery. And again, remember those numbers. People like recreational shopping, they like history. And so huge numbers go by Terry. I mean, 1 million or so people, and so maybe more. And they're looking for a place to stop, and they're looking for something like this. So here's a community with trail systems and a nice hotel and history and places to get out and walk and enjoy and stretch your legs and let the kids run around and wear themselves out so they'll nap in the car. And that wasn't it, though. They looked at, well, I got ahead of myself. They updated their websites. They put it online so that people using their smartphones on the highway would know what was there, and they connected it all. And so, and the other important thing here is the power of leveraged funds. Main Street program invested about $30,000 into this program. The Office of Tourism, through numerous grants, invested $70,000. So we have over 6 figures invested in a community and transforming it. And they're just getting started. They're working forward on all sorts of other projects to complement this. And most importantly, their downtown before these projects was separated. All the businesses and restaurants were separated from the museum. And if you can connect those into one effort and fill that void, then when someone comes into town, they're not just going to gas up and look and see an empty building and say, there's nothing that way. They'll continue walking. And so you really promote the entire community through projects, through history in this instance. Here's Shelby. Now, they've come in and done a historical walking tour. They have the longest continuous, I'm checking myself because I have a historic preservationist in the room, but you have the longest continuous Art Deco downtown anywhere, or at least, in the entire world. And so, and so you have these wonderful buildings and structures in this downtown. You have a railroad that comes through and people get off and stop. And so they wanted to do a historical walking tour, and they put it online, and they had it an audio tour, and so they really took it to the next level. But they didn't do that alone. They also, at the end of that block, had this building. This is the Rainbow Hotel building. It sat vacant and boarded up. And so anyone who drove into the community saw this first. And if you don't know a community, you may not know that there's this really interesting historical downtown and all sorts of restaurants and businesses beyond this. You might see that and turn around and get back on the interstate and drive back to Alberta. But they recently came in for a grant through the Main Street program for $15,000 to do an architectural assessment of this building, in combination with $30,000 of grants in 2 other programs in commerce, a business plan, so that we're taking a building, we're assessing the structural integrity of it. We're also combining it with a business plan to recruit businesses into the building. So it isn't just saving a building so it can sit vacant. It's saving a building so it can remain standing and then bring in the businesses and contribute to the tax base. It's like Great Falls example. And they incorporated that building into their master plan. Here it is before. Here's the idea of what it could look like. And it was adjacent to a historic heritage park. This is the the famous Jack Dempsey fight up in Shelby in 1923, right on the spot of that location, adjacent to that empty building and basically flanking the approach to the downtown. They're going to create a real life-size ring with some seating and an interpretation trail. Again, something to get out of the car and do and understand the history in Montana here. And so they were awarded $50,000 through the Office of Tourism, again, leveraging funds, all these projects coordinated in a larger effort and vision to improve their community. Remember the car I showed you earlier, right on the hood here, driven all the way into Boston, promoting the Jack Dempsey's world-famous fight in July in Shelby. So yeah, all roads connect in Montana. Here we are in Lewistown. Lewistown's been a member that, through the Main Street program, commissioned a consultant to come in and do a historic, a tourism assessment of their community. They want to build their tourism economy, like a lot of communities, as we've learned, but they want to do it responsibly. So they brought someone in to look at the community through the eyes of a tourist, assess customer service, storefront signage, wayfinding, signage to direct you to where to find the downtown. Some communities, if you don't know where you're going, you drive right past the downtown because there isn't a clearly prominent sign that says historic downtown or museum. And so she did all sorts of things. She found that there was a big sign on the side of a building with an arrow that said historic museum this way, but then people would park their cars there and would cover it, and so no one saw it. And so she really kind of had an ability to find those sorts of things. And so she looked online. What kind of first impression does the community make? Can visitors even find the community? And so through the Main Street program, we were able to fund a wayfinding study, which basically is how to put signage in the community that gets people to these businesses, to the historical attractions, to the parks and the attractions. Here in Helena, we did a very exciting project, and I'm not being facetious here. We conducted a property tax analysis and revenue mapping project, which sounds not that cool, but what we did was we brought in a consultant, and they actually, we awarded Helena a grant, and Helena brought in a consultant to look at their downtown and assess what these buildings generated in tax dollars. So if you have 3 stories of a building, 2 that are vacant, this consultant was looking at what per acre the value of that building was. And so in the downtown, he found that per acre, it was $16,612, each building a little different, but on average, that's what the revenue was for the city, the tax revenue. And then he looked at Walmart and its big parking lot, and that turned out to be about $2,500, really just showing that you can't tax parking lots. And I'm not saying, Walmart's bad or whatever. I'm just saying that there's potentials in those buildings. So if it's empty and you have upper floors that are empty, we could bring in business or look to work together as a community to raise that tax base. And so again, we've awarded numerous grants this last round. One I didn't mention was Miles City. We awarded $10,000 to create what's called a tax increment financing district, basically a potential funding source for future projects in their downtown. They have huge growth on my family's from Miles City, so they have huge growth on one exit of town. My grandmother could not find her house if she went there for the life of her. They built it, they spent a winter in the garage with a wood stove when my dad was 1 or something. And so they couldn't find that now. I just know they couldn't. But it's development, and it's necessary. Another entrance into the town goes by all the museums and to the historic Olive. And with some improvement with signage and getting people into that downtown and really looking to restore some of those downtown buildings, they'll be able to pull from that tax increment financing district potentially as a revenue source to forward some of those projects. And so, and some that I didn't mention, we just awarded Glasgow a downtown revitalization plan. Deer Lodge, again, working off of all their cultural and historic assets there and building tourism. Glendive. The point here is that we've had a lot of communities come in on different projects, forwarding work. And so, I just want to really highlight the point that there are cities all over the state doing great work in their downtown that really demonstrate similarities with some of the projects I've shared with you today. And we've tracked our numbers and not ours as a program, but ours as a state. And so 10 communities in our program that reported consistently last year. This includes Great Falls with their Arvon block. 31 new businesses, 222 full-time jobs, public investment and private investment of over $12 million, and volunteer hours of almost 34,000 in just 10 communities in Montana. We volunteer huge amounts here. We all serve to the 10th degree. We do great work as volunteers all over Montana. I just want to point that out, that it's very encouraging what we can do when really we pull up our sleeves. And we do all sorts of different projects. The idea here is to keep it wide and balanced. And in a community like Terry, we can help them along the way. If they have 6 or 7 different projects, likely they fall within those pillars, the 4 points of the Main Street program, and we can work with them to really transform a downtown because we're so versatile in our projects. Because we realize that restoring a downtown, revitalizing a downtown isn't a one-lane road. There are numerous projects that you're trying to keep and coordinate, all moving at the same time, rather than the traffic jam trying to cross this river here. And so I want to end with one final story. It's Whitehall. Whitehall, in 2009, suffered a terrible fire in their downtown. That was a very bad week for Montana downtowns. There was a fire in Miles City, the explosion in Bozeman. And for a small rural town, and again, I'll make it clear, I'm kind of connecting to that White Sulphur Springs story, that there's a lot of that frequency. That's your small rural town. It's the death knell. There was a fire in your downtown. You've lost a huge percentage of your historic buildings and retail potential. What can you do now? So Whitehall came in a year ago, a few years after the fire. They regrouped, and they focused on the Borden building here. Now, this building, again, is a great example of a building with numerous state organizations working together. SHPO was involved in some of the process. We were able to fund Whitehall about $10,000 for one of those TIF districts for their downtown. But those districts are they generate funds based on property values. And the idea would be to start them when the property value is low and let property value rise, and there'd be more of a chance for revenue. And so when you look at the Borden's building here, it was identified as a wonderful location for retail and housing. Now, when I took this photo, you still had frames of signs. Someone had facetiously, you can actually see it here, spray painted shop local on a vacant storefront, which, there were boarded up windows, there were broken windows, yet there was a business down at the end that took pride in their spot, put flowers out front, and continued to move forward. But it's harder to get people to stop if, there's broken windows. And they certainly made an effort to keep the windows full of local community events and things like that. But basically, there was a need to do something. And so they came in and like I said, we funded part of the project, SHPO, other organizations, but now they're working and pushing forward to renovate it. And it should look like this, which isn't a huge transformation, but the point is that now it has some integrity. You can bring in businesses. There will be much needed housing. Rural Montana needs housing desperately. And so they've created housing in the upstairs. But most importantly, a year into this project, which would be about 5 years after the fires, someone purchased this building because they heard about the Borden project. And so they bought it and they said, we want to put some other housing upstairs and we want to bring in 2 business spaces in the bottom. We want to renovate the building. We want to restore the facade, the crumbling facade, to look like the original historic structure. We want to do it in a way that's designed and not just slap some paint on the crumbling facade. We want to do it right. And so now they're looking at funding options to restore that building. It's an example of replication of original project. There's a theory out there that if you're going to transform a downtown, start with a block and work block by block outward to transform it rather than just going randomly. Again, it's that organization that we talk about in this program. But so here you have 2 parts of the trifecta. The third, and you may know it, it's the Star Theater, is on the other side of the empty lot. See, I didn't tell you that. The empty lot is right across the street. So here you have 2 points. The third point of the trifecta would be the Star Theater. Glenn Marks wrote a book about Montana. Part of it is set in Whitehall. donated all proceeds towards the Star Theater. They were faced with basically outdated equipment. All theater equipment is shifting to digital, and so rural theaters in America with limited funding resources need to do this update or face closing their doors. And the update for the equipment is about $80,000, $90,000. And so this community banded together, working with a local author and other groups to raise funds to do the digital switch, which they're working towards and they're likely to succeed at. They're already talking about the potential down the line of restoring the theater, because the digital switch was step one. So here you have three major projects surrounding a burnt out lot that could have been the perceived death knell of a small rural town. They've really rallied around their pride in their community and the potential of it as well. And it comes down to this: the Office of Tourism pillar of vibrant and charming small towns that serve as gateways to our natural wonders, between the parks and everything we've been talking about tonight, and capitalizing on that pride and potential of your community. And in a small town, in that 15,000 miles that I drive, I saw this on the board. This is a quote by Margaret Mead. This was one of those towns with 6 or 8 people that wanted to transform their downtown, working through an organization that had built a building, that had purchased a building that was vacant, similar to a lot of the projects we've talked about tonight, but also supporting the business, recruiting business, bringing people downtown. And this isn't a program about buildings, it's a program about community and building better communities. And so this really, I thought, captured the spirit of their community and their effort and what we do in the Main Street program. And that wraps it up. I appreciate your time this evening. I can open it up to questions. I think I'm on time. I'm here for questions, and I have materials as well. So thank you very much.